Thank you all for being here this morning. Appreciate the attendance of everyone, especially our visitors. Brother Larry has been leading a series of studies that examine questions that Jesus asked during his ministry, and I've been planning on joining him in that effort, but have been hindered by other series I've been working on and finishing. And this morning I'd like to come to that series, and the question I'd like to consider is the question that Jesus posed there and highlighted in yellow in the text. Which one of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? Let's read this text again. And he said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? If then you are not able to do as small a thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today, and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not seek what you are to eat, and what you are to drink, nor be worried. For all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." In late 2020, something I didn't expect happened to me. It was a weird year, I'm sure you all know. We faced a worldwide pandemic. We endured, I use the word endured specifically, a very contested presidential election. We witnessed widespread civil unrest that surpassed anything our country had seen since the past 50 years. Personally, I'd started a new job, took me into a brand new industry. So you'd think I was ready for the unexpected, but one night I was startled in bed with a feeling I had not felt before. My hands and my feet started sweating. I became unbearably cold. In my chest, I felt a constant sense of uncontrollable fluttering. I didn't know what to do, so I slapped on my Apple Watch, took an ECG. It seemed fine, but I didn't feel fine. "So cold," I told Carissa. But the ERs were full, and I knew that people were being turned away. So instead of seeking care, I drew a hot bath and tried to tough it out. I continued to take EKGs. I went back and looked in my health app. I took one at 1:19 a.m., 4:18 a.m., 5:11 a.m., 5:17 a.m. I finally went to sleep, and when I woke up, everything was fine. So I thought, that's weird. Maybe it's just a fluke. So I went about my business, but a couple months later, it happened again. Same symptoms, similar sleepless night. I had a lot of health anxiety for the next year or so, a lot more than I would care to talk about this morning. And I don't know how it happened or when it happened, but that health-related anxiety got better. I accepted my situation, stopped worrying about it. Now, when I read this passage in Luke chapter 12, I realize that Jesus is very precisely setting out the cure for the common anxiety. And I wish I would have thought more deeply about these words, and maybe it would have spared me some serious grief back then. Now, I don't want to downplay anxiety. This text is about anxiety, and I don't want to downplay it. I know it's serious. I know it's crippling. On the contrary, we need to recognize that it can be real. Jesus recognizes that anxiety can be real. I think a lot about a quote from C.S. Lewis in his very famous book, Mere Christianity. He wrote this. He said, "Human beings judge one another by their external actions. God judges them by their moral choices. When a neurotic who has a pathological horror of cats forces himself to pick up a cat for some good reason, it is quite possible that in God's eyes he has shown more courage than a healthy man who may have shown in winning the VC. And the VC is the British version of the Purple Heart. we judge people by what we see, but God looks inside, and he knows the moral decisions we make. And he knows that different people have different levels of anxiety and struggles and mental challenges, and he understands that. And so he weighs us by our moral choices. And so I recognize completely that anxiety is real and crippling. But you know what else is real? The words that Jesus spoke. And we need to get real about what Jesus said. He tells us, don't be anxious. And he wouldn't have told us that if it weren't possible. You can overcome your anxiety, your worries, your crippling fears. And Jesus tells you how. Now, I'm not an expert, and I won't pretend to be an expert in the science of anxiety. I won't even talk about it because I don't know anything about it. My story is strictly an anecdote. However, what we're going to study this morning comes from Jesus himself. And he understands anxiety, and he understands you because he faced anxiety and he created you. And so if there were ever a person to listen to on this subject, it would be Jesus. Don't listen to my words. Listen to his. Now, verse 34 is a simple and timeless command. He said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. I don't think a command could get any easier to understand than this one. Don't be anxious. You know, you might say, that's all well and good, but the ancient people, they didn't really understand anxiety. They didn't know the medical implications. They didn't understand the causes. And if you were to say that, you would be wrong. It's incorrect. In fact, to say this is to borrow from C.S. Lewis, the sin of chronological snobbery, because the ancients weren't so dim-witted like we think they were. They were very wise. And strictly from a historical perspective, the ancients knew a lot about anxiety. Consider this quote from a book called Ecclesiasticus, which was written it's not in the Bible, but it was written about 2 centuries before Jesus, written by a Jew. Listen to what he says about anxiety. He says, jealousy and anger shorten life, and anxiety brings on premature old age. He knew about the medical implications of anxiety. He says having anxiety shortens your life. It's crippling. That was 2 centuries before Jesus spoke these words. About 100 years after Jesus spoke these words, here's another book. It's not in our Bible, but it shows you what the ancients thought about anxiety. This is from a book called The Shepherd of Hermas. For as old people, having no longer hope of becoming young again, expect nothing else but to die, so you also, being weakened by the affairs of the world. Now, the Greek word he uses for affairs of the world, hold on to that, because Jesus is going to use that exact same Greek word. He says, so you also, being weakened by the affairs of the world, give yourselves to repining and not casting your cares on the Lord. But your spirit was broken, and you were aged by your sorrows. Your anxieties for the cares of the world, the affairs of the world, that's a word that is associated with anxiety by the Greeks. Your anxieties about all the problems of life, they just make you old. So 200 years before Jesus, 100 years before Jesus, the ancients knew all about the physical, medical implications of anxiety. It is a crippling disease on your soul, and it shortens your lifespan. The ancients understood anxiety. They understood that the affairs of the world could break your spirit, shave off years of your life. And Jesus used that very same word for affairs of the world that I just read in Luke 21:34. In fact, he says that anxiety has an effect upon us that is similar to drunkenness. It weighs us down. Luke 21:34, but watch yourselves lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness, so that makes sense, and with cares of this life. That's that same word that we just used. That day may come upon you suddenly like a trap. Now, it's really easy for us to look down on those who went before us, but in reality, we know surprisingly little more about the causes of anxiety than did the ancients. We just don't know a whole lot more than they did. And may I suggest we know far less about its cure than does Jesus. So when Jesus says, do not be anxious about your life, I beg you, I plead with you, take him seriously. He's giving you a cure that will make your life so much better. Take him seriously. Don't pretend that modern anxiety is more nuanced and complicated than it was back 2,000 years ago. Now, if you're a Christian this morning, believe the words of Jesus because he's the risen Lord of all creation. He's coming again to judge the living and the dead. But if you're not a Christian this morning, let me ask you to trust the evidence of your eyes and your ears. You know, the end of the book, 1984, the final rule of the party was to convince people to ignore the evidence of their eyes and ears. I'm asking you to trust the evidence of your eyes and ears. Are people today more or less anxious and worried than they were decades ago? I'm not asking a complicated question that requires a PhD or years of study and research. I'm asking you to evaluate your own memory and evaluate the evidence of your eyes and your ears. Let me ask it again. As our culture has put more distance between itself and the teachings of the Bible, are people more or less anxious and worried? That's my question. And if you're being honest, you know how to answer that question. And if you've answered it honestly, Jesus deserves a fair hearing this morning. Now, this text can be divided into what we call in biblical studies a chiastic structure. The first block aligns with the last block. So Jesus says at the top, do not be anxious about your life. He says at the very end, do not be worried. That's the same thing. Don't worry about what you will eat, or about your body. At the end, he says, don't seek what you're to eat or what you're to drink. So the first sentence and the last sentence line up. And as you start at the ends and work your way back to the middle, they align. That's called a chiasm or a chiastic structure. In the second tier, he says, consider the ravens, and again, consider the lilies. And in the very middle, he asks the question that we're asking today, and which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to your span of life? And so, if you work from the outside of this structure, the outline of the text, back to the middle, it causes us to have three main realizations that Jesus wants us to learn from the text. Number one, he wants us to recognize what really matters in life. Number two, he wants us to respect God's care and providence. And number three, at the heart of it, he wants us to realize the futility of anxiety. Now, those are the 3 points we'll look at this morning. Number one, we recognize what really matters in life. Number two, we respect God's care and providence. And number three, we realize the futility of anxiety. Before we proceed, we must avoid a very common temptation today. We must avoid the temptation by so reducing the radius of what Jesus is talking about that we've made him say nothing at all. Because that's what we typically do with this text. Well, he isn't talking about medically diagnosed anxiety. Oh, he's only describing the anxieties that are caused by the bottom rung of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's not us. And whatever he's describing, he's surely not talking about my anxiety and my fears and my worries. Now, if you aren't sure if Jesus is talking to you, let me assure you, he is. Don't so reduce this to where it means nothing. This is the creator of all things and the creator of your soul, and he knows you better than you know yourself. So my encouragement to you is to drink his words in and let them really have an effect upon your heart. And don't give up after a day or a week or even a year. We're talking about giving our lives to the teaching of Jesus. Number one, recognize what really matters in life. Luke 12:23, the start of our text, for life is more than food and the body more than clothing. And at the end of that block, do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, nor be worried. Now in this passage, like many others, Jesus is emphasizing the importance of having right priorities. It's not about food. It's not about drink. It's not about clothing. Life is so much more, he says, than those things. Now, if you were to read the book of Luke, you would realize that Jesus often in this book addresses our priorities and how we get them wrong. So, for instance, in Luke chapter 9, verse 24, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. In chapter 11, verse 27, as he said these things, a woman in the crowd raised her voice and said to him, blessed is the womb that bore you and the breasts at which you nursed. But he said, blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and keep it. Luke 12:15, and he said to them, Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Luke 14:26. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father or mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, and yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Luke 17:33. Whoever seeks to preserve his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will keep it. And if you were to take all those statements that Jesus gives about priorities and distill them down to the basic truth, you would see three things. Number one, that obedience is dearer than family. I know your family is dear, but obedience to God is more dear, he says. Number two, life is more valuable than possessions. We love our stuff, but life is more valuable than just the stuff. And number three, Jesus is more important than we are. So here in this passage, our life is more than food or clothing. You might say, but I can't live without food and clothing. And you'd be right. All the same, these words say what they say. Life is more than the things that keep you alive. So the first step, according to Jesus, in tackling your anxiety is to understand what really matters in life. And this happens because anxiety is often caused by having too big a fixation on things that don't matter in the grand scheme of things. And I mean grand scheme of things in a very literal way. Because there are things at work that from the viewpoint of eternity will make your fears about health and your finances or any daily needs you have seem like much ado about nothing. So small that you'll forget about it. Do you remember when you were a child and every little roadblock or setback seemed to be a mountain-sized obstacle? I was practicing this morning and I read that line and Brooklyn says, I don't know anybody who acts like that. I acted like that when I was a kid. You get a bad grade on a paper and you're convinced you'll never get to go to college. Well, you finally get into college in spite of your bad performance at times, and you get a bad score on an exam and you're convinced I'll never get a job. And you finally get a job and you get passed over for the promotion that you applied for and that you really thought you deserved, and you think, my career is over. Every setback and roadblock seems an insurmountable mountain. If you'll allow me, I'd like to quote from the great philosopher Brad Paisley. He wrote a song entitled Letter to Me. And in the song, he writes a hypothetical letter to himself when he was 17, and he talks about his struggles with his ex-girlfriend. He talks about how he nearly failed algebra. Talks about how he missed his Aunt Rita. He talks about how he wished he had taken both Spanish and typing classes. But as he concludes the song, in the bridge of the song, he writes these words. To himself at 17, he says, you've got so much up ahead. You'll make new friends. You should see your kids and wife. And I'd end by saying, have no fear. These are nowhere near the best years of your life. How silly our childhood anxieties were. And we forget about them because time has matured us. We're adults now. How much more mature shall we be in eternity? Cares of this life will evaporate. Whenever your kids are having a completely unjustified meltdown, you try to console them and you say something like this, it's fine, everything's gonna be all right in the end. It's not a big deal. But they're short-sighted, they can't see that. My life is over. But as a parent, you know that of all the things that matter in the world, the thing causing today's breakdown doesn't crack the top 10,000. They haven't figured out priorities yet. And that's fine. They're kids. They're immature. Doesn't mean their pain isn't real. But it does mean that if they only had a little more trust in what mom and dad were saying, they would start to feel better. Jesus, with the wisdom of all eternity, speaks the same thing to you in your anxiety. One of these days, you're going to laugh about the greatest trouble you face in life. Maybe you'll write a sappy country song about it. Jesus invites you to trust that he knows better Trust that if your priorities align with his priorities, your anxieties will evaporate as quickly as even the densest fog in the hot summer sun. Number 2, Jesus tells us to respect God's care and providence. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And then the opposite part of that chiasm, he says, consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? Now, Jesus uses 2 analogies to demonstrate God's providential hand in his creation, ravens and lilies. Now, the ravens don't know a thing about farming. They can't make provisions for the future. Their little birdie brains just can't compute that. And yet, all the same, God feeds them. And that phrase that Jesus used there, it matters. God feeds them. Jesus didn't say they're still able to find food. No, he uses the active voice. God feeds them. Consider Jesus' words just a few verses earlier in Luke chapter 12. He says in verse 6, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies, and not one of them is forgotten before God? Why, even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, you are of more value than many sparrows. Did you catch that? What a marvelous thought that not a single sparrow is, to quote Jesus, forgotten before God. 1 billion years from now, God will remember the short life of every single bird that ever took flight. They're not forgotten before God. When we were kids, we found a nest of baby birds in our attic. And our house at the time had one of those big attic fans like houses used to have. And we tried to care and feed for them, and I've long forgotten what's happened to them. I am sure they died from malnutrition or exposure or from the very unwise care provided by little kids. But God knows them. Millennia can pass from now, and I could go before the throne of God and say, God, what happened to those birds? And he's going to know how old they were, which one hatched first, who died first, what happened to the mama, how long their lives were to the very millisecond, what their little birdie brains were thinking about. God knows it all. Not a single bird is forgotten by God, says Jesus. Of how much more value are you than birds? The second analogy is even more remarkable, lilies. Now, ravens, at least they have some degree of sentience. They can respond to stimuli, but lilies don't really. They can't. They are a lesser form of life, at least as humans think about it. They can't sow. They can't spin. Yet, Jesus says they're arrayed in splendor that dwarfs that of even the wisest and wealthiest kings. How much more will he clothe you? I don't know about you, but when I finish cutting grass, we put it in the dumpster and it's gone. I don't think about it. Every blade of grass was clothed by God. He cared for it. How much more will he clothe you than he says, "O you of little faith"? Now, this is a phrase that is very unpopular today. We easily pass over it because I think we're afraid of its implications. And it's become trendy to rebuke Christians who dismiss mental health problems when they say, "Oh, you just need to have more faith." Now, if a Christian uses that phrase to very dispassionately and carelessly dismiss someone's needs, then they should be rebuked. That's not a great way to talk to people. Not at all. But here Jesus uses those very words, "You of little faith." And we would be wise to heed him. Listen, one reason for our anxiety is because we lack faith. That's not me, that's Jesus. This does not mean that anxiety is trivial or small. In fact, consider some of the other occasions where Jesus uses the phrase, "O you of little faith." In Mark 8:26, he calms the storm and says, "O you of little faith." Whenever he saved Peter from drowning, when Peter attempted to walk on water, he says, "Oh, you of little faith." When his disciples were unable to cast out a demon in Matthew 17:20, he says something very similar, "Oh, you of little faith." Storms, drowning, demon exorcism, these are very weighty things to us. They're not to God. They're nothing to God. And so Jesus finds us in our anxiety and he says, "Trust me, you of little faith." He extends his hand as the waters sweep over our heads, saying, "You may doubt your own ability to walk on water. Do not doubt mine." Jesus is in control. He is caring for his children. Believe it. Number 3, Jesus tells us to realize the futility of anxiety. Luke 12:25-26, "And which of you by being anxious can add a single hour to his span of life? If then you are not able to do as small a thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest?" Now this verse stands at the heart of that chiasm, which suggests that it also stands at the heart of the matter. Anxiety cures nothing. Now, there's been some debate about how to translate this text. The older translations say something like, "Which of you by being anxious can add a single cubit to his height?" And it could mean that. If it refers to height, it would mean something like a cubit to your height. So let's say between 14 to 18 inches to your height. But almost all modern translations instead translate it "add an hour to your lifespan," noting that the word for span can mean age. It does in Hebrews 11 and John chapter 9. And that as a practical matter, adding 18 inches to your height would not be a small thing like Jesus says. It makes more sense to say, which one of you by being worried can even add 1 hour to your life? You can't. You're going to die, and no amount of worrying is going to fix that. In fact, it might make it worse. So most translations, and I think correctly, translate this as, "By being anxious, can one of you add a single hour to your span of life?" Now, ironically, this refutes the notion that Jesus isn't talking about real anxiety. He's just talking about being concerned. Because as it turns out, being concerned can be healthy and it can make things better. You are concerned about your diet or your health and you eat better, and you can add not only hours but years to your life. If we're just talking about concern, I was talking to Dustin about your child driving. If you're concerned about your child driving, you can spend more time with them in the grocery store parking lot, and that can make it better. So we're not talking here about healthy concern. Jesus is not talking about healthy concern. He's talking about the crippling anxiety that weighs us down, that's preventing us from being who God needs us, calls us, desires for us to be. We're talking about the anxiety that puts your life in permanent neutral. The type of anxiety that greases the soles of your feet so that no matter which way you want to walk, you can really only do 2 things: stand still or fall flat. We're not talking about the healthy concern to make things better. We're talking about an unhealthy obsession that almost surely makes things worse. What we're talking about is worrying for the sake of worrying. It accomplishes no good. In fact, it's a weight on your soul that you carry around every single day. It's a sickness of the spirit. Feeding your soul with a steady diet of worry and anxiety will only make it grow slow and fat. Prevents you from moving forward in life. I know a little bit, the guys who played flag football with me yesterday know a little bit about me growing old and fat. In spite of my best efforts, I wasn't a spring chicken out in that football field yesterday. Now, on the other hand, there is a superpower you can have in life if you can learn to develop it. Be it at school, in the workplace, in your marriage, related to your retirement account, in politics, you name it. If you can develop this superpower, it will change your life. And that's the ability to stop worrying about things you can't control. That's what Jesus is telling us. You can't control, you're gonna die, you can't control the length of your life. Spending your time worrying about it is wasting the little bit of life you have. It's what Jesus means when he says you are not able to do so small a thing as that. If you can't make it better, don't be anxious about it. The Bible says in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. There are things in life you can't control. Peter says, give them to God. Cast them upon the mighty hand of God. Now, it's been said before that we like to cast our anxieties on God the same way we like to cast a fishing line. We throw it out there, we look at it for a minute, I don't really like it, and so we reel her back in. Over here, not really, and we'll reel her back in. That's not what Peter means when he says to cast your cares upon God. Should be more like when you cast a penny in the fountain at the shopping mall. For those of you under 18, a shopping mall is a place where they used to have a bunch of stores together in a central location, and kids would love to hang out there. They had video games in the arcade and a food court. You cast that penny in the fountain at the shopping mall, you walk away and you don't think about it anymore. I mean, it's not like you forgot about it. You know that you did it, but it's not, I'm moving on. There is a big difference between the phrases to forget something and to stop thinking about something. I'm going to say it again. This is really important. There's a big difference in forgetting about a thing and to stop thinking about a thing. Jesus is not saying you got to forget your troubles. That's what drugs and alcohol do. They make you forget. You're going to remember that you have troubles. Jesus never says that, but he does say to stop thinking about it all the time. Our world gets this so backwards. As I was preparing this lesson, I got a push notification from Apple talking about some new way to deal with your anxiety that I think gets it backwards in all the wrong ways. We tell ourselves to overcome our anxiety, we have to think about it all the time. We got to dwell on it. We got to break it down and understand it 7 ways from Sunday. No. Stop thinking about yourself all the time, Jesus says. It's not going to make it better. This connects us back to faith. Do we hold on to our cares because, at least in part, we don't believe that God will take care of them? In Mark chapter 9, when a man with a son, and the son had an unclean spirit, and the son was brought to Jesus, Jesus used phrases like this. He says, "O faithless generation." He says, all things are possible if you only believe. The boy's father didn't say, Jesus, now you know it's not a faith problem. The man said, Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. May I suggest to you that this is the prayer, help my unbelief, that we offer in the depths of our anxiety. Maybe instead of saying, God, will you magically lift my burden, we pray that, God, will you make me strong enough to hold it up? Everyone is different, I admit. But in my experience, at least personally, anxiety connects often to a lack of faith in something. My anxiety about flying has a lot to do with the lack of faith I have in the aircraft and the Boeing Corporation. In spite of all the evidence to the contrary, you're more likely to die in a car crash than you are in an airplane. That's what the stats show. Doesn't matter. Flying gives me anxiety. My anxiety about my health has a lot to do with the lack of faith and the DNA I got from my mom and dad, who both have heart problems. If you put together the Minson family tree, it's just one big tree of cardiovascular issues all the way back to Adam and Eve. My anxiety about the Dallas Cowboys has a lot to do with the fact that I have zero faith in that coaching staff. Maybe even the owner, I don't know. Again, I know it's unpopular to blame anxiety on a lack of faith, but I'm urging you just to at least entertain the question. Do I really trust God, or when I say that I believe, am I just giving him lip service? Because it might just be that faith is what you need to make it through your troubles. Now, Jesus gives us 2 verses as an appendix. These aren't in the chiasm, but I think they're really important. We read them earlier. I want to think about them just briefly as we come to a close. He says in verse 32, "Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." Now, Jesus concluded the previous section by saying, seek his kingdom, and these things, the needs of life, will be added to you. And in this verse, he doubles down on the blessings of the kingdom. He starts by calling his disciples. He's talking to his disciples in this text. This text starts by saying he was addressing his disciples. He calls them a little flock. This is the only time that Jesus ever used that phrase, little flock. In other words, he's saying, you're not much to look at. You're small and inconsequential. From the perspective of other people, this little merry band of disciples doesn't really matter that much. A bunch of low-income fishermen. Maybe a few of them were well-to-do. In fact, a few of them were certainly well-to-do, but just a ragtag group of disciples. Little flock. I think about this church. No offense. We're a little flock. Little flock. It says, fear not, little flock. It's your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Just like the Israelites of old, God chose to give his disciples the kingdom. For them, it wasn't because they were great and deserving. In fact, it's quite the opposite, just like the Israelites. Deuteronomy 7:7 says, it was not because you were more in number than other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you are fewest of all peoples, but it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers. Listen, it's not because you're a great and numerous flock. The reason you matter is because God loves you. Fear not, little flock. It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. God loves us. He has chosen to give us the kingdom. I love that word there, translated good pleasure. It means in the Greek exactly what it means in the English. It delights the Father. It gives the Father great joy and pleasure to bless his children with the kingdom. It's the same word that God uses when he says, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. God wants to bless you. You're a child of the King, so don't fear. We're going to win. See, our anxiety is not stayed by our mere faith that God is in control, but in our trust that he also delights to give us the kingdom, to bless us. You know, having a really rich and powerful dad isn't that great if he doesn't ever give you stuff. But God is not only all-powerful, he loves to bless his children. Your anxieties, your fears that cripple you, right now they're like that of a child on Christmas Eve. She isn't sure if mom and dad is going to get her anything but an old lump of coal. I mean, they have the means to give her something. They love her and want to give her something. So why is she afraid? It's because she's a little kid. Jesus is asking us to put our childish fears aside and trust that the Father loves to, he desires to, he delights to bless his children. The next phrase there in verses 33 through 34, sell your possessions, give to the needy, provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches, no moth destroys, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Now, I wouldn't blame you if you read these final two verses in this section, and thought, I don't see the connection. We're talking about anxiety here. I can see the connection in verse 32. Don't be afraid. Don't have anxiety. God loves you. He wants to bless you. I get that. But I don't see the connection here. In fact, in Matthew chapter 6, for these two verses, the parallel is used in a section that is not about anxiety. So you might say, I don't see the connection, but I think the connection is very real, and it deserves to be thought about for just a moment. The key is that verse 34. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Anxiety is a sickness, it's an illness, it's a disease that weighs on your heart. You might say, oh, well, science knows that it happens in the mind. Jesus knew we had brains too. Let's not commit chronological snobbery. The heart is a metaphor for the seat of our emotions, and that's where anxiety weighs us down. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be. You want to get your heart right, start thinking about your treasure. That's what Jesus is saying, and because of that, I think there's a real connection. Caring for other people can be a great way to keep your anxiety at bay. Because all of a sudden you're not thinking about yourself so much, you're thinking about the people I'm trying to help. A lot of times parents, when their kids leave the house, they've spent all their time thinking and worrying about their kids. They have what, Dad talked about this a few weeks ago, empty nest syndrome. Because now they're not caring for anybody and they can't find meaning and value in life. Now, you might say that, well, carrying somebody as a curative for anxiety, that is just kicking the can down the road. You're not really curing your anxiety, you're just suppressing it. You can't do that forever. You know what? You're right. You don't have to do it forever, you just got to do it till you die. That's really what we're talking. Nothing in life is going to be made perfect. That's one of the root causes of our anxiety is we want this life to be perfect. We want all of our troubles and worries to go away. They're going to be here until you die. And Jesus is saying, I'm giving you a way to think about life, to organize your thoughts, to orient your life as a way of serving other people that will help you stop thinking about yourself. You do that all your life, and you die. And look what happened. You helped a lot of other people along the way. You've busied yourself with the service of others. Now, whether or not you think that serving other people is a good remedy for anxiety, we are still commanded to do it. 1 Corinthians 10:24, let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Philippians 2:3-4, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Think more about others than you think about yourself, in other words. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also the interests of others. So even if you don't think that caring for other people can help cure your anxiety, you're commanded to do it. So let me challenge you. If you're having anxiety, spend the next week serving other people every chance you get. And do it the week after that. And come back to me and tell me if that doesn't make you feel better. I think you'll find that it does. When Jesus said, sell your possessions and give to the needy, Jesus didn't hit a random proverb generator. He said them because they can and will provide great relief. In conclusion, I would like to shift to another text for just a moment. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 8-11. For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us again. On him we have set our hope, that he will deliver us again. You also must help us by prayer, so that many will give thanks on our behalf for the blessing granted us through the prayers of many. Now, we don't know what specific experience Paul was talking about in Asia back in verse 8. It could be the riot described in Acts chapter 19. I'm actually more inclined to think it's something else that happened in that window. Paul was there for a couple of years. And so it's some horrible event that happened to Paul. And he says, listen to his words, we despaired of life itself. We thought we received the sentence of death. We wanted to die. That's what he said. We despaired of living. I woke up in the morning and I was upset that God's making me live another day. That's what he's saying. I despaired of life. That's how bad whatever was happening in Asia became for him. Paul's point, though, is not to describe his troubles. That's why we actually don't know exactly what he was talking about. His point was to describe God's powerful deliverance. Why did God allow this? Why would God burden us down with this? Why would God put us in such deadly peril? He answers it, to make us not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. Your anxieties and cares and troubles can be transformed into an incredible strength. The complete and final realization that God is all you need. Listen, if you go through a life of worry and fear and anxiety and you learn that lesson, you will be far more blessed than the richest, most carefree person who's ever walked the face of this earth. Because you realize on the other side of your pain and anxiety a truth that you wouldn't have found in some other way, that God put us through this so we would learn not to rely on ourselves but on God. Later in the book he says in chapter 12, verse 9, my grace is sufficient. This is Jesus speaking to Paul. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Your anxiety is a weakness. But inside of it, God's power can be made perfect, and you can mature. Your delivery from anxiety, your pathway to strength Your road to healing goes through Jesus and not away from him. I fear that all too often the coping mechanisms our society has adopted to deal with anxiety tell us to find the answer by looking inward. Jesus says, find the answer by looking upward. Your anxiety will evaporate like the dense mist in the summer sun. The lesson this morning is yours. Thank you for your time and attention. I wrote this sermon out word for word because I didn't want to accidentally say something that would get me in trouble. It probably was going to get me in trouble anyway. But I'm telling you, from my experience, I told that story. I was really hesitant to even tell that story because I know that there are a lot of challenges that people have that are far more serious than the little story I told at the start. But I believe in the words of Jesus. I believe that you can overcome your anxiety and crippling fears. I don't believe you have to wear them around on your sleeve. I don't believe you got to think about yourself all the time. I think you can do what Jesus said and be a victor. I think you can be like Paul and overcome and be stronger because of your anxiety than to suffer defeat as a victim of it. I hope this lesson has benefited you in some way. I know that it's benefited me in its study. If you need the help of the church this morning in any way, we'd love to help you, whether it's to receive the prayers of the church or to put the Lord on in baptism. If you're of either class, won't you come as we stand and as we sing?